All right, we're going to get into section 3. We're going to talk about multiplying and dividing signed numbers. So far we've done addition and subtraction. Now, multiplying and dividing, there's some rules that we need to know for when you're multiplying and dividing positive and negative numbers. Some of these you probably are familiar with already, though. If you have two numbers that have the same sign, so if they're both positive or if they're both negative, when you multiply them, and this also goes into dividing, then your answer is going to be positive. So even if you're taking a negative times a negative or a negative divided by a negative, your final answer is still going to be positive. Now, if they're unlike, so if you have one of each, you have one positive and one negative, then your final answer is a negative number. So these are some of the main rules that you guys need to know when it comes to multiplying and dividing numbers. So if I take negative 12 times negative 2, what am I going to get for an answer? So positive 24. How about 10 times 3? Next one. And the last one. So negative 35. Again, if you're dealing with really big numbers and you don't know how to, or you don't know what that would be in your head, use a calculator. Okay, if you were doing like 125 times negative 15, you don't have to do that the long way. You guys can just type that in. Now we also have a property called the multiplicative identity. We saw some properties when we were adding numbers. We talked about the additive identity and the additive inverse. So multiplicative identity is when you are taking your number times 1, and anything times 1 is going to just be equal to itself. It's almost like you're adding 0 to it in a sense of the additive one, but when we're multiplying, we're not going to multiply by 0 and get the same number. We're going to multiply by 1. All right, so now they might start throwing like larger numbers, or they might start doing more than just 2, so like 3 or 4 or more numbers being multiplied together. So if I have 4 times negative 2 times 6, you could group this, so you're taking 4 times negative 2 first, which would be negative 8, and then times 6, and what would that be? Negative 48. So group numbers that are easier for you to multiply, especially if you're trying to do it mentally. Group numbers that you know just by memory first, and then try to multiply anything else. How about number 2? What would be negative 3 times 4? So negative 12 times negative 5 would be 60. So negative 2 times negative 8 would be positive 16 times negative 3, so negative 48. Now, if they start doing problems like this where you've got 3, 4, 5, or more numbers that you're trying to multiply together, you really need to watch your signs. Because if they start throwing in some negatives, not all of them are negative, only a couple, and depending on how many numbers you're multiplying by, that's going to change what type of signed number you're going to have. So some rules that you can follow is if the sign of the product is positive, so after you've multiplied everything, if you get a positive number, that means then that the number of negative factors you had in your problem was an even amount. So if I had 2 negatives, 4 negatives, 6 negatives, 8 negatives, even numbers of negative numbers, and I'm multiplying them, I'm going to get a positive answer. Now, if the sign of the product is negative, so if your final answer is a negative number instead, that means then that the number of negative factors you had was odd. So you had 3 of them, or 5 of them instead. So it might be helpful when you guys get into multiplying to kind of count, like, how many negative numbers do you see? Is it even or odd? Because then that'll tell you, is your final answer going to be positive or negative? So for this first one, I see negative 2, negative 1, and negative 3. So there's 3 odd negatives there. So that's an odd number, which means that my final answer is going to be negative. Anybody know what the answer is going to be for that one? Good, negative 36. Okay, so you guys take a minute, do 2, 3, and 4. Decide first if it's going to be an even or I'm sorry, if it's going to be a positive or a negative number, and then write down what you think the answer should be. So for number 2, how many negative numbers do you have? An even or an odd amount? Even, because you've only got 2 of them. Since it's even, that means that your final answer should have been positive. What did you guys get? Good. How about for number 3? 0. Anytime you see a 0 in the problem, it automatically it's a big 0. You don't even have to think about if it's positive or negative for this. Okay, for number 4, you've got negative 9, negative 2, negative 1. That's an odd amount. That means that your final answer should be negative. And what did you guys get? Good, negative 144. Okay, next problem says that in a 3-week period, a technology stock declined approximately 2 points each week. How many points did the stock decline in 3 weeks? How would we do this? Each week it declines 2 points, and I want to figure out how much it declined overall for 3 weeks. So what would you guys do? What's that? Okay, now since it's declining, let's do negative 2. So this is going to tell me how many points I've lost over the 3 weeks. So 3 times negative 2 is going to be negative 6. So a way to interpret that would be that this declined by 6 points. So that stock lost value over that 3-week period. Now the last thing I want to do with multiplying numbers before we get into dividing is when you've got numbers that have exponents attached to them. And there's just some kind of rules that you guys can use to help you understand whether your answer should be positive or negative. So a positive number raised to any natural number power is going to be positive. So like 3 squared or 3 to the 5th power, 3 to the 10th power, you're going to get a positive answer for that. 0 raised to any number is 0, because you're just taking 0 times itself a bunch of times. Now, negatives change a little bit. So if you have a negative number and it's raised to an even exponent, so if it's like squared to the 4th, to the 6th, to the 8th, those kind of exponents, your final answer is going to be positive because you've got an even amount of those negative numbers. Now, if you're taking a negative number and you're raising it to an odd power, so if you're taking it to the 3rd power, to the 5th power, that now changes it so you have an odd amount of negatives, so then your final answer is negative. So it still falls into those rules that I talked about earlier. So remember, numbers that have exponents, like 4 to the 3rd, that's the same thing as taking 4 times 4 times 4. What times 4 times 4 times 4? 64. Most calculators have an exponent button on them that you guys can use too. So you don't have to write it out. You should just be able to use that key. Number 2, 0 raised to the 8th power is going to be what? 0. Now on these last couple, they're kind of switching the powers on you a little bit. So like if you look 3 and 4, those kind of match because it's negative 2 to the 4th power. But notice how like 3 has negative 2 in parentheses and 4 doesn't. And this is something I talk to students about all the time. When they're typing stuff in on their calculator, especially like recently I've been working with the quadratic formula in Algebra 2, and there's a part that says b squared. And I always emphasize, if you're plugging it into your calculator, you have to put parentheses around your negative numbers. Because if you don't, your calculator doesn't understand order of operations, and it assumes if you just type the negative in, that the negative is like sitting in front of the number all the time. So if I put parentheses around negative 2, this is like taking negative 2 times negative 2 4 times. So I'm going to get a positive number here. So I'm going to get 4 and another 4. So 4 times 4, which is going to be 16. But if you don't put it in parentheses, here's how your calculator would read it. You're taking 2 times itself 4 times yet, so you're still going to get 16, but there's a negative sitting outside. So it negates the whole answer. So watch how like the problems are written, but if you are using a calculator to type in a sentence like that, or if you have a bunch of numbers, put parentheses around those negatives, or you will get wrong answers because your calculator doesn't have the same brain as you. You know order of operations, your calculator does not. So you have to teach it, you have to tell it what you want it to do. Now 5 and 6, we have a similar thing here. If you guys have a calculator, or you can do this, can you tell me what negative 3 to the 5th power would be? Now number 6 is 3 to the 5th with a negative, so I also get negative 243. Can you guys tell me why I got negatives both times there? Right, so on number 5, you're taking negative 3 times itself 5 times. 5 is an odd number, so the odd amount of negatives causes the whole answer to be negative. Even though it was in parentheses, it's like you have that extra negative attached and it negates the whole answer then for you. All right, last thing we're going to get into is dividing. The same rules apply like we talked about with multiplication. They're just written out here again for you. If your signs are the same and you're dividing, your answer should be positive. So if you're positive divided by positive, negative divided by negative. If they're opposite signs, then your final answer should be negative. So the rules have not changed from multiplication to division. All right, so what would be negative 8 divided by negative 2? 4. 6 divided by 3? 2. What's the next answer? And the last one? Negative 9. Last thing I need to end on is what happens when you start having zeros in your division problems. If you're taking 0 divided by anything, the answer is always 0. Okay, for example, if I take 0 and I divide by 4, I'm going to get 0. If I take 0 and I divide by 400, I'm still going to get 0. Okay, it's like 0 times anything. 0 divided by anything is always 0. Now we have problems when we try to divide by 0. We cannot divide by 0. It is actually impossible to do that. Okay, I want you guys to think about it this way. I come to class and I bring no cookies. How many cookies did everybody get? 0. Nobody got one. Okay, let's say I bring 20 cookies on Saturday, but none of you show up. How do I divide those cookies out? But I don't want them. So I can't divide them out if you guys aren't here. So I cannot take my items and divide them out to 0 people. They have nowhere to go. So it's actually impossible for me to do that. So I can't divide by 0. If you're taking a number divided by 0, like 4 divided by 0, if you actually type that in your calculator will give you an error message. It won't do it. It'll say like divide by 0 error, or it may just say error. This is called undefined. Now there's a special case, and you may not have heard of this before, but it's called indeterminate. That's when you actually are trying to take 0 and divide by 0. You're trying to take 0 things and divide it to 0 things, and you get indeterminate. So depending on which case you see, you have to write down the appropriate answer. So for number 1, if I'm taking -3 divided by 0, what's my answer? Undefined. 0 divided by 0. Good. Indeterminate. 0 divided by -5? 0.